We just sat here in silence for an hour and a half. Wouldn't that be super awkward? Hi. Welcome. Nina.
Hello. This is the harm reduction session. So if you're looking for Mark Dolan, that's on some other floor. This is the harm reduction session. My name is Nina Herzog, and I'm here because I've been working in harm reduction for a really long time. Back in the day, I started the harm reduction programs along with the Housing Works founders all the way back in the early 90s. So started the harm reduction programs there with needle exchange and all that good stuff. And ever since then, I've been working in harm reduction and supportive housing. And back then, it was a really alternative, new, bright and shiny idea. And now look at this room, it's packed. So I'm really excited that you're here. And we're gonna have a good time. I'm gonna pass it on to my friends here.
Hi everyone, my name's Shyanne Becker. I'm the program director at Jericho Project's Walton House. It's the, I think, only supportive housing program right now under New York 1515 for young adults. Within our program, we have 89 units. 33 are for young adults who are mostly LGBTQ, and then 56 are for veterans who are serviced through the HUD-BASH program.
Hi, my name is Shyanne Hope Cross. I'm 25 years old, and I'm the young adult peer mentor for Walton House at Jericho Project.
Cool.
And so we know each other because we work together at Walton House, designing harm reduction strategies in supportive housing for young adult LGBTQ folks. All right, so can everybody hear? Yeah. Cool. All right. So really, I think I really kind of wanted to call this harm reduction for skeptics, but only afterwards. So, but that's kind of the idea. Like when I was pitching this, the idea was that, we're gonna, well, maybe I'll just follow my slides. So what we're gonna talk about is just with the beginning of why is everybody talking about harm reduction all of a sudden, really? And then we're going to do some basic introduction to harm reduction, and then some myths, and then talk about troubleshooting harm reduction, kind of just a harm reduction orientation towards solving problems in supportive housing. And then we're going to talk about some really concrete tools that you can use in terms of harm reduction, some harm reduction tools in supportive housing. I just want to get a feel for how many people here are already, like, where it says religion, they write harm reduction. Do you know what I mean? Like, how many? Yeah. All right. And how many people are familiar with harm reduction and use it as appropriate? Whatever that means. Ah, very interesting. And how many people, and you can totally say it, remember I wanted to call this harm reduction for skeptics, are harm reduction skeptics. All right, awesome, thank you I appreciate that, that's really great. Okay, so why is everybody suddenly talking about harm reduction? And this is really important because there is a reason. There's kind of two reasons. One is that the evidence base for harm reduction as an intervention and an approach to working with people who are actively using drugs or alcohol, which in this room is probably the majority of us, and in every room is probably the majority of us, has an enormous research base now, right? So it started with using harm reduction to save people's lives, to prevent the spread of AIDS and HIV in America. That's kind of what we imported it for. And then we just started realizing that harm reduction in stages of change and was a really, really positive intervention for helping people transform their lives and their relationships with drugs, alcohol, and risk behaviors in general. So that's one reason. One reason is that it's evidence-based and it works, and we now know it works. That's awesome. The other reason, honestly, is a very pragmatic reason, and that is that housing first, largely, or at least in a big way, thanks to the efforts of Shinny and CSH and other supportive housing groups, housing first has now been adopted really even by HUD as the basic standard, right? And so that means that we believe and we know that the most cost-effective way to address homelessness is to first provide housing. And so first thing you do is give someone a place to stay. And then, once they just have a place to call home, have an address, have just the most fundamental needs met, then you can start addressing complex problems. Does that make sense to people? Yeah. So now that we have housing first, now we suddenly have this whole, right, everybody believes in housing first, and what's tucked into housing first is, well, that means you need to be working in harm reduction, right? So now all these organizations and people who didn't necessarily come to harm reduction as a... Willingly. I was looking for the, weren't born again into harm reduction. You know what I mean? It wasn't like suddenly like, whoa, this is right. It wasn't like that. It was like, oh, here's the contract. And the contract says we have to do this. Or here's the RFP. We're going to write that we do this and we're going to start doing it. And that's a difficult shift to make, right? And so this... Part of this is to help people is to help people understand that there really is a really strong reason to make that shift, that shift makes sense. Yeah. What happens next? So harm reduction is a public health approach, which is really important because that means that what we're talking about is kind of like immunization, right? Like it makes sense in a scientific level as a societal response. It's a set of strategies, it's a set of principles and approaches, and it's also a social justice movement. I'm going to talk about that a little bit, although that could be like a day long. And so just the basic ingredients of harm reduction. Dignity and respect for people who use drugs. And what I'm going to say about that is that I guess I can just offer a challenge to say, is there any group of people who don't deserve dignity and respect that we serve? No, probably, right? No. So people who use drugs also deserve the same dignity and respect. And even though we probably know that when we back into it, harm reduction really places that at the forefront because we understand that for many, many years, that isn't something we could take for granted. And so, like, I personally just avoid using, and this is important to me, like, I never refer to somebody as an addict because people who are using drugs are also a whole bunch of other things, right? Like they're parents, or they're moviegoers, or they're Agatha Christie fans, or they're, you know what I mean? Like they're just so many things. And to reduce any one person to the main problem that we are ascribing to them in our conversation is, for me, questionable. So if somebody wants to refer to themselves that way, that's completely up to them. I might consider myself an addict, but I wouldn't necessarily want Shane to talk to me about, like, my colleague, the addict, is blah, blah, blah. Do you know what I mean? It's just not that good. So it's a really important distinction to make, this idea of treating people with dignity and respect and seeing people who use drugs as people first and foremost, who do a lot of things, including one thing that we're going to deal with, which is their drug use, if that's something they're interested in dealing with. And then this could be a really long, day long, and it is in a way, and I referred to Mark Dones, who's awesomely doing essentially a day long here. You really cannot, you should not, talk about harm reduction or the war on drugs without placing it really, really, really squarely in the social context of white supremacist, racialized culture in America. And the best thing I can say is if you haven't read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, you should, and you'll understand that the one thing I'll say to just clearly dispel the notion is that the war on drugs came before what we think of as the crack epidemic, right? It was not a response to the crack epidemic. It was a war on black and brown people. So it's just very important, and a whole bunch of stuff was then fabricated to support it. And that's a really important part of harm reduction, because the war on drugs and drug use in general, which is disproportionately used to incarcerate and get black and brown folks under the supervision of the state, is, even though we have research that says that people of all ethnicities and races use drugs basically in the same amounts. So it's really important that we understand that drugs and drug war and drug policies serve that purpose. Yeah, the only group that really uses drugs more, and that's also proportionately, tends to be youth. And we all kind of know that, don't we? You know what I mean? Because a lot of us then grow out of it, or not. So I'm going to try to keep myself out of this.
Wait, can I make a point?
Yeah, please. Everybody make points.
So something that was just in the news recently that we all probably know, Jeff Sessions was trying to go after the states that recently legalized marijuana, right? And he's like, we're going to get rid of this, blah, blah, blah. The Trump administration told him to back off. That is not a winning argument anymore. It's not. Like, I'm not going to swear on the stage, but it's not. So I just wanted to make that point.
You pro-Trumper. Keep it to yourself. No, I'm just kidding. So
he loves gay people.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. And they love him. And we gay people love him. All right, moving right along. So where am I now? Oh, yeah. So the other thing that's really important in harm reduction and in more and more evidence-based practices, right, is that people who use drugs actively have to have a seat at the table in designing programs, and certainly have to be the authors of their own services, right? And all of these things that we're talking about, these basic principles, these are the basic principles that repeat in pretty much every evidence-based practice approach that we're looking at and that we're using and that we have to design our programs around in supportive housing, like trauma-informed care, recovery-oriented practice, person-centered planning. And all of these things basically are founded in self-determination, non-judgmental approaches, positive outlook, being hopeful, seeing recovery as a journey, not a destination, using a stages of change model, being culturally competent and contextual, strengths-based, trauma-informed. And that is a picture of it. So the basic ingredients, respect, trust, a non-judgmental stance. And not just that, because those words sound nice and we like to be around people who are like that, but because they're the essential components of an effective therapeutic relationship. So the other thing that's really important is that harm reduction takes as a basic assumption that clients, people, want to make positive changes. And the clinician or people working with them can use strategies to help them move along a continuum, right? So those things are really important. We assume people are doing the best they can, because they are. We might not see that, but it's not for us to see or judge. Stages of change. Those are them. So no, but like we're moving across, right? I'm assuming everybody kind of knows this.
We'll get to motivational interviewing.
Oh wait, that's you. You're gonna, yeah. So that's right. So and then just understanding that people move through stages that before I'm thinking about making a change, you coming in and yelling, even at the top of your voice, that you see something that I need to change and you're certain of it, is not going to budge me. But it's really going to make you annoying to me. And I'm not really going to want to see you. I'm going to kind of move when when you come toward me and things like that. So harm reduction also sees, as we said, drug use as a complex, multifaceted phenomenon, right? It's a biopsychosocial phenomenon. We don't really use the disease model, where this is a disease and the only way you can be well is to abstain. That may or may not be true for somebody, but it doesn't mean you can do that. So why are we talking? We have to talk about what you can do, right? So it includes a continuum of behaviors from severe abuse to total abstinence, and acknowledges that some ways of using are safer than others, right? So in general, injecting drugs is the most dangerous way of using a drug. In general, swallowing a drug is a lesser risky way, right? And there are just biological, physiological reasons for that. And people are always, whenever I do trainings on harm reduction, one of the things I'm looking at them because I do trainings for them. But one of the things I always write on the pre-test and the post-test is true or false. The best way to reduce the harm caused by IV drug use, harm reductionists would say, is to stop using IV drugs. True or false? True. But everybody fails that question in the pretest, don't worry. But after the training, you're going to know that it's not. So we never, as harm reductionists, we do not minimize the damage and harm that drugs can cause people, right? Like, that's not a part of harm reduction. But harm reduction is really based in the idea of really seeing human beings as human beings, not as, how many of us want to change a behavior, and then so I wake up in the morning and I'm like, you know what? I think I should ride my bike 20 minutes every morning. So tomorrow I'm going to wake up and I'm going to ride my bike for 20 minutes. And how many of us then wake up and then just ride our bikes for 20? It just doesn't. Maybe some of you do, but I don't want to be your friends. Maybe that's not what I said. I don't know what you heard.
We're being recorded, I would like to remind you.
So then that's what he said. So that's it, right? That's the hierarchy of harm reduction. The most effective way to reduce IV drug use, for sure, is to not inject drugs, right? That's true. But that doesn't mean everyone can do it. So that's why it's a hierarchy. And it's all about hierarchies in harm reduction. So never start using drugs. And even if you do use drugs, don't inject. If you inject, get assistance to stop injecting. If you're not able to stop injecting, don't share. And if you're not able to stop sharing, then make sure you get clean needles. Right? And what we would do as providers is just help people locate where they are and have them be as safe as they can where they are. How are we doing on time? Good. Okay, good. And so what we measure and what we really, and I'm hoping by the end of this we are all we, that's my agenda, actually, I have an agenda. What we're measuring as meaningful and important for people is the quality of individual and community life and well-being, not necessarily cessation of all drug use. That's what we're measuring. That's what we're saying is a successful intervention, that somebody increases the quality of their life, so that if they need to stop, if they need to be, well, you guys are going to actually talk about some examples. And so it also recognizes that people's experiences of poverty, class, racism, social isolation, past trauma, sex-based discrimination, other social inequities, homelessness, right, affect both people's vulnerability to drug use and capacity to deal with drug use. And as I said, does not attempt to minimize or ignore the real and tragic harm and danger associated with illicit and licit drug use. Shyanne?
Nina. So just to reiterate kind of the things that Nina said, harm reduction is not about stopping people from doing drugs or telling them that they can't do drugs. It's just informing them of the risk of drugs so that they're aware of the things that they're putting into their bodies. It takes no position on drug use, but it acknowledges the existence in society because drugs is normalized, especially in today's day and age. Harm reduction takes responsibility off the drug user. I think it's the opposite. Drug users are essential and seen as the experts and authors of their own services and programs. Because like us all, we know what's best for ourselves, regardless of other people's input and the things that we go through in our day-to-day life. Harm reduction encourages drug use. Research shows that harm reduction does not encourage drug use. I believe that it doesn't because of the fact of, I think it informs them. And the more that they go through things, the more that they'll learn to use other crutches. If they continue to use drugs, they continue to use drugs. But they learn to utilize other services and programs to find other crutches that drugs used to be for them.
Well, and it's about not telling them to stop, right? Like Nina said, they're not going to hear that. We're not going to hear that. I don't know if you have a landlord or a neighbor or someone who tries and tells you to do something. No, you know what you're doing. You know you're the expert in your life, right? So it's about helping them find strategies. Like maybe you smoke when you get home from work, so that by the time you wake up the next morning, you're not high anymore, right? You're not smoking at 9 a.m. before you go in. That's a harm reduction strategy, a very simple one.
And even look, when you're on your third drink, you're hanging out with your friends, right? And you say to yourself, God, if I have if I have 4, right, then I'm gonna be really hungover. Like that, that's harm reduction. That's all you're doing, right? You're figuring out how much of the balance you feel like striking between like kind of feeling good and relaxing and getting the stress and the boss out of your head, and how much of a how much of a hangover you can tolerate, you know? And some days you're like, I can just tolerate that hangover and I'm going to stay out till 2. And other days you're like, you know what? I'm just not going to drink for a year or whatever, right? But you came to that, right? It wasn't because your best friend or your partner or your mother or anyone else finally got through to you. I mean, maybe, but I don't think so.
Can't rely on it.
No. So harm reduction does not, this is, again, research-based, does not encourage drug use.
What are the benefits of harm reduction? One of the benefits is that it reduces the spread of HIV, hepatitis C, and other infection. It's cost-effective. It engages drug users, making it easier for them to get up at any stage of drug use. It requires we provide drug users with access to factual information about drugs and their effects, not just that they're bad.
So coffee example?
Oh, yeah, did coffee. That was a good one, yeah.
So I have a tenant who lives in the building, and when I first met him, he informed me that he liked to smoke coffee beans.
Exactly.
So, in me trying to understand why it was coffee beans and things like that, one of the questions that I asked him was, does he even know what's in Folgers for him to even be taking it in his body through his nose? And he couldn't answer the question. So one of the things that we worked out together was actually figuring out why this was something that he actually liked to do, what was about it for him, and what was the effects that snorting coffee beans was going to soon have on his brain and his body. So after helping him realize that, he no longer does it, but it still was just interesting just to see that he was willing to take something in his body and he didn't understand what it was or how it would affect him, because if it's meant to drink, why is it going up your nose, you know? So that's
he Googled it, right?
Yeah, he did. Afterwards, we did Google it together.
Right, and that's what you were saying, that you said, let's Google it. Let's
find out.
Right. So that's kind of what was so cool, was that you were just kind of like, okay, so let's find out what you're doing.
Yeah, it
right?
wasn't
and
like
then he was kind of horrified. Yeah, right. So that's just like a regular response, right? Oh, this is kind of nasty what I'm doing. Right, you know, and so
just saves lives, the needle exchange, methadone, Narcan, overdose reversal, and fentanyl strips.
Do you guys know what fentanyl strips are? Yeah, they're just the little test strips. You put a little of your drug on there, and you see how much fentanyl's in there, risk of overdose, and it's crazy how much is in there. Crazy.
Right, because what's happening is that so many different drugs are now being cut with fentanyl, and fentanyl is like 50 times stronger than heroin. So just like a drop of it, will create an overdose, and you think you're using coke, right? Which isn't or meth, which isn't supposed to give you an opioid, right? Overdose, right? So that's what the fentanyl strips are for, to check for fentanyl in your drugs. Okay, who's this? Me?
That's you.
Okay. And the other thing about harm reduction is that it allows us to build with people effective and trusting and honest relationships, like in Shyanne's experience, right? So this, like they sort of traversed the person's situation with their drug use together and honestly and without judgment. It was like they were like, okay, so let's look at what you're doing with the coffee beans in your up your nose, right? And then what they found was discouraging to both of them, right? But it's that type of relationship, because this person felt like they could go to Shyanne and say, this is what I'm doing, without fear of being judged or mocked, or, right, like that opened that door. So if that door wasn't open because Shyanne presented herself as non-judgmental, then that conversation just wouldn't have happened at all. And that's really fundamental. Shyanne.
Oh, that's you.
That's me? Mm-hmm. You're kidding. Oh, that is wrong. No, because we're on that one. You guys went ahead.
No, we didn't.
Wait, did I? Wait. Look, what are the benefits of harm reduction? Mm-hmm. And then the next one is troubleshooting tips. Do your best to keep your judgments to yourself.
I think we're missing a slide.
No, we did that one. We're on this one.
Well, sorry, guys. I'm not sure what's going on. Oh, wait, so this is you.
My fault. Do your best to keep your judgments to yourself. I realized working in this field that being non-judgmental, even though you'll hear some of the craziest things in the world, is one of the things that changes the relationship. And even in the sense of my own traumatic experiences, it even allows them to get an eyesight to who I am as a person, as well as opening the door for me to approach the topics with them. We will also say, we all judge, so don't beat yourself up. If you do, there are times where I've heard a story and like my expression has been all over my face, even if I didn't say something. So in certain times like that, I just have to acknowledge it and I move on. And it makes residents be less honest with you if they feel like you are judging them. So it helps that if you even if you feel like you know that you're being judgmental, just be honest about it, because most of us know when we're being judged. We know when someone is watching us or looking at us in a way that we feel it. So just be honest with that. Yeah.
A good example of that would be when I just messed up the slides and I felt all of your judgment.
Oh, shit.
No, that was my judgment.
Just acknowledge it and move on, everyone.
So this is like a fundamental tip, right? So now we're getting into localize, don't globalize. So one thing that people often, that comes up in supportive housing, right, is that you have a neighbor who's going to you as the case manager or life coach or program director, whatever you are, and saying, so-and-so's pot smoke is really, really bothering me. And often when I'm working with organizations, then, the question will then be, how do I help so-and-so reduce his or her pot smoke or smoke less or whatever? And then I always think to myself, well, but the problem actually in this case isn't that the person it's not their smoking, it's their smoke. It's a completely different problem. The problem is their smoke. So there are things you can do to hide smoke, to make smoke smell different, you can use a vape, there are just all these different things. You can use one of those ashtrays that like sucks up smoke. You can, But the point is that there are so many problems that we start to, because we're born to judge, and our brains are kind of, and this is an important part of what Shyanne was saying too, is that we're really, our judgment is a way of keeping us safe, right? Like that's, in our brains, that's what our judgment thinks it's doing. So we really have to work hard to look past our own sort of quick framing of a thing and see, wait a minute, what is the actual problem here, right? And so keep the problem small, not sort of larger than it is. Look at the actual behavior, frame the behavior as objectively and specifically as you can. Example of pot smoke bothering neighbor. And it's the difference between shame and guilt, right? If you look at an act, you can say, maybe I did something wrong. That's feeling guilty, and that's something you can fix. If you look at an enormous thing, right, then it's shame. And that's much more difficult, and it's much more deep-rooted. And that says, I am bad. And we don't want to say to people, you are bad, or your big, huge way of life is bad. We want to say, your smoke is bad to this person, right?
Oh, this is me. So HR troubleshooting tips. What harm reduction really does is it helps to give residents a sense of agency over their use. So with that, individual behaviors are easier to address than the difficult patterns. This week has been a tough week in Walton House. We have a lot of infighting going on with our young adult residents. You know, brains aren't fully formed. Something happens, I'm gonna punch you. A harm reduction technique of that is, okay, if you're gonna fight, fighting is a thing that you do, that's your knee-jerk reaction. When you do it in the building, in the lobby, that's a lease violation. In the building, right? Outside of the building, your lease doesn't cover you. Like they can hopefully make the connection of like, oh, if I do this, if I react at my apartment door, if I react when I'm in the community room, there's gonna be a litany of things that management is gonna bring to me. If I do it outside, maybe the police will get me. Not ideal in my perspective, right? I don't want my residents in jail, but it's a harm reduction technique. Don't put your housing at risk, right? You wanna set small, achievable goals. Something at Walton that we do, well, throughout Jericho, we make service plans with our clients, right? The big service goal may be housing as the heading, but then you have smaller objectives inside of that. So working on budgeting for your rent, working on ensuring that you're not doing lease violations by speaking with your life coach about issues you're having within the building. So those little, smaller, achievable goals. Begin to shift the relationship with their drug use. So yes, in the sense of drug use, well, you guys get it. The I am bad is deeper and more intrinsic. So exactly what Nina was saying before.
Actually, I'll go ahead and share a personal use of harm reduction, which I don't usually share, and I'm not sure why I moved to. It's because of all of your beautiful faces. When my mom died, my dad, who's a very heavy drinker, was devastated. And so he's a heavy drinker anyway, but he would wake up in the morning and he would I was going to say an S word. No lie. He would wake up and he'd take a glass like this and he would fill it with vodka to here. He would open his throat up and he would bring it down. Just the whole thing. And now, right, this man is lost. And this is how he copes anyway, but now he's lost. Now he's like, the worst thing has happened to him. But the thing is, like, we got to get a headstone. We got to plan a funeral. We have lies that we have to do. So we have tasks we have to do, right? And so I thought to myself, well, Nina, you're in harm reduction. Why don't you just use some harm reduction? So I sat him down and I said, do you think that maybe you could start at noon? You could just start at noon, and then in the morning, we will just do all the errands that we have to do together, right? And then after that, just do whatever you need to do. And he did. you know.
And the S got done, right?
Yes, the S got done. Yeah, and I mean what he wound up doing, which is he did what he always does, which is says, "Oh, I've already stopped drinking," but whatever. That's another story. But the point is, he did, you know, because I spoke to him, and I spoke to him honestly, and you know, whatever. So, what's next, Shyanne?
Don't assume someone can't do something or change something just because they haven't yet. One of the hardest things about being a young adult, period, is the fact of you have a whole life ahead of you. You know what I'm saying? It's easy to get caught up in the moment of the things that's happening to you here and now, especially when you're being traumatized at a very heightened level. So one of the things that a lot of young adults have a problem with is actually getting confidence, keeping that confidence, and able to do more goals with the same confidence. So one of the things is that we just make sure that we just try to always make them believe in them doing something, even if it is ludicrous. Like, we be the person who doesn't give up hope or stop believing in them after everyone else does. Because, like I said, a lot of them don't have the same support system that a lot of us have, and we all desperately need someone to believe in us.
Yeah. Okay, and now, why you're here.
So the tools that are utilized in supportive housing with harm reduction. One thing that we do is we contextualize the drug use for the tenants. So this is, I feel like, pretty obvious, but none of us may think about it when we go home, right? Like, I live in an apartment building in Harlem. Does my neighbor do drugs? Yeah. One of them does, at least, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you know this, but Harlem is kind of taken over by like the Broadway crowd. They have weird hours. They do stuff, okay? And then even if we're not in New York City, like we go into the suburbs, we buy a house. On that cul-de-sac, is someone doing a drug? Yes, absolutely. So we have an unfair standard for supportive housing. And that's, I think, one of the biggest key points in the whole shift towards harm reduction, the whole shift towards housing first. How are we going to tell someone who's sleeping on a bench, like, okay, but stop heroin, then we'll give you a house? How are they going to do that, you guys, right? That's insane. I'm glad we've moved away from it.
But I always, it's so important to say this to tenants too, right? Because for some reason they get from us that we've set a standard that people can only be good if they abstain from drugs, right? And you can't live in America in a neighborhood or a building where you can expect that your neighbors are abstaining from drugs. It's just not possible. So, yeah. Anyway, and it's important to kind of say things like that.
Well, and think about in your house, any one of you, not all of you, do you have a bar cart? Is it really pretty? Right? A bar cart, a bar, somewhere where like there's bottles of things that you think are pretty, or you're saving this excellent bottle of wine for a special occasion. Our tenants in our apartment inspections, they think they have to hide that. Like, no, you don't. That's not what this is about.
Yeah. So when we start to talk about harm reduction, right, and when we start talking about setting small, achievable goals, right, like with my dad, where, like, I didn't say to my father, hey, can you know, I'm going to go home in 10 days after the funeral, can you just start drinking after I leave? Because that'll make it easier for me. Because I didn't think that he could do that. I didn't think that, you know, but I thought he might be able to start at noon. And so I set for my father what I thought might be an achievable goal. And that's really critical because what you're trying to do is really shift the person's relationship with their drug use. So if they've been using drugs for a long time, have a long and chaotic history of maybe quote unquote failed attempts, right, at traditional drug treatment, then you're talking about somebody who has really been beaten down by their relationship with drugs, right? And they think they have no agency in this relationship. And by creating goals that are achievable for them, you can start to bring them back into a relationship with their drug use or their substance use, right? So that they can start to think, look, I can do this, actually. I can start at noon. And, I can talk to you about it, too. I have someone to talk to about it, and I'm going to make my step isn't abstinence. My step is noon. That's a step I can take. I can ponder that step. So here are some of the things that you can consider in constructing achievable goals. The amount, the frequency, the route of administration, right, which we're going to have a slide on next. The environment is really critical, right? If you shoot up by yourself, that's dangerous, right? Because what if you overdose? So it's safer to be with someone else. If you shoot up someplace where the police can get you, that's unsafe. So you want to shoot up someplace that you're not going to get sent to because you want to be able to tackle this issue. You don't want to go to jail for this issue. So this is the basic hierarchy of risk, right? So in general, swallowing a drug is the least harmful, followed by snorting, smoking, and injecting, right? Injecting brings a whole lot of problems in terms of HIV, Hep C, just, all kinds of really serious systemic infections.
Well, and I think I want to point out on this too, as part of our myths, this isn't saying swallowing is okay, right? We're not saying swallow a drug. We're not saying that. We're saying if you're doing drugs, swallowing is the safest, right? That's an important distinction to make. And I think that's where a lot of people who are not anti-harm reduction, but skeptics was the word, think that seeing a slide like this, that we're saying, swallow a drug, and that's not the point.
No, right. But it's also, we're not saying it's okay or it's not okay. We're acknowledging that it exists. We're acknowledging that because people swallow drugs and snort drugs and smoke, and it makes sense to talk about which of these is more harmful than the other, right? That's kind of the idea. And we're certainly, so while we might not be saying it's okay or not okay, what we're certainly not suggesting is that it's not dangerous, right? Nobody's suggesting that, ever.
We should okay, I have an idea.
Okay.
So I think we talk a lot about drug use and this stuff, right? But think about all of this in terms of driving a car. We're not telling you driving a car is okay or not okay, right? You do it. Putting a seatbelt on is a harm reduction technique to driving a car or to being a passenger in a cab. I bike in New York City. That's arguably more dangerous than injecting heroin.
Well, and also to clarify, the seatbelt is a really great harm reduction analogy because there is probably nothing, if you drive, there's probably nothing more risky that you do in your life wait, okay, let me show you. There is probably nothing more risky than driving that you do in your life. I'm sorry. That was the best I could do. But you understand what I'm saying. Driving is the greatest cause of fatalities. And we all get into cars or cabs or whatever, as if, right? Because whatever. But then we put on a seatbelt.
Hopefully.
So that's good. Because we need to get around. People need to go to work. We've accepted this level of risk, right? But it is a level of risk. And every time we put a seatbelt on, we are acknowledging that this is a risk, right? So that's the idea.
And I do wear a helmet, if you were wondering.
They were all wondering. Another tool that's really wonderful, basically to guide a discussion and also to memorialize a moment in a person's journey, right? Because you can do this again and again and again and again. This isn't, again, it's not a destination, it's a journey. So working with a decisional balance matrix or sheet, as it is here, you can work with the person when they're thinking about changing a behavior. So, and then you can talk through with them what are the advantages and disadvantages of not changing the behavior. In other words, that brings you to a conversation where you can say, what is good about your injecting heroin, right? Like, let's talk about what you get from it, because that's something right now that you need. It's really important that we talk about what it is this need is fulfilling, right? Or what need this is fulfilling. Oh, God. And what are the disadvantages of it? Same thing. And start first with the advantages when you're talking about drug use, right? So what are the advantages of this? And what are the non-advantages? And just listen, right? And ask them to write it down. And then ask them what would be if you're considering, say we're considering starting at noon instead of, or let's say we're just considering starting at 5, right? So you can not drink at work. Or weekends, sure, right? So let's say we're just going to try with weekends. So what are the disadvantages of starting during the week, of not drinking during the weekend, right? Like, for instance, one disadvantage is it might be tough to go out with your friends, all of whom are drinking and you're not, right? It's a new thing. It's going to be a new thing. It's going to be difficult. But what are the advantages? Well, I'm going to feel really clear-eyed on Saturday morning, like the whole Saturday I'm going to have. And then you do that, right? And then you do it again, and then you do it again, and the person, leaves with it, and so that's a really good tool. Shane?
Oh, I almost skipped a slide again. So motivational interviewing. Who here is familiar with motivational interviewing?
Wow.
Amazing. That's so good.
Yeah.
So this, we've been alluding to it throughout the training, but this is an evidence-based practice that essentially is designed to keep the client talking about their own experience and takes the onus off of us as frontline workers, clinicians, takes the pressure off of us a little bit. It allows the client to feel and know that they are the expert on their own situation. It's a lot of reflecting back what they're saying to us. So mirroring what they're saying, giving double-sided reflections if they're telling us two different things. Something we like to say is people tend to talk out of both sides of their mouths. So they'll tell us they're doing one thing, but their actions are showing a completely different thing. We're all in supportive housing here, so I'm sure we've all dealt with incidents where they come and sit down in our office and they tell us what happened. And you're like, okay, but the security camera showed this. And they're like, oh. So yeah, their actions are opposite of what they're actually saying. And that can be a really good tool for them to be like, okay, I'm saying this, but I'm not actually walking that talk, right? So really, and it's also about expressing empathy. So all throughout anything that we're doing, we should be showing empathy. That's how we're going to create the allegiance that Shyanne was talking about before. Develop discrepancies. You're rolling with the resistance. So if someone is completely resisting what you're saying, your reflections and all of that, meet them where they're at. They may not be ready for stages of change that you would hope that they're ready for. And that's fine. That's fine. You're challenging the rationalization and then supporting self-efficacy. So again, this is very much driven by the client and where they are. And then you don't have to carry it around. You're not in charge, right?
And it's when you were talking about people talking out of both sides of their mouths and having not slides. What am I? Help me! Don't just look at me. Help
I don't
me.
know. What are you talking about?
Camera system.
Oh.
I just thought to myself, thank God my wife doesn't have a camera system in the house. Do you know what I mean? Because we say them, but it's us. We all do these things, right? This is not, we're talking about this because the one thing we all have in common, we have two things in common, all of us here. We're in supportive housing and we're human, right? And so this is just a good way to work with humans. And so we're going to talk, but we're talking about in supportive housing because that's what we do with humans. But it's such an important thing, right? Because we all do these things. These are just the way humans work. This is a good thing on working with humans and their real foibles, right? Who we really are. Budgeting. Oh, I have to do this. I made this. And the reason is because it did not exist. And what's so bizarre is I would do these trainings, right, and I would look online for like harm reduction budgeting worksheet, and there's nothing there. And when we talked, budgeting is so critical. It's such an important conversation to have, such an important way that we can help people, right, to help work through these ideas. But we don't generally say, and so how much are you spending on drugs? But we sit there, we're like doing these budgeting things, like, and we're all taking it so seriously. Like, this is the amount of money you get, and this is the amount of, right? And there's no reference to street economy in our budgets. And it's like, why do it? I mean, it's just totally not real. It's like, I stopped smoking. Do you know what that did to my budget? Like, I mean, for me to make it's like, it's nuts. And bananas, as people are. But, for me to have, imagine if I had made a monthly budget that did not include my cigarettes many years ago, right? I mean, and that's kind of what we're doing. We're talking to people and we're like, talking about their budgets, and we're not including both. If you can get it, it would be awesome to get information from people both about what they're spending in the street economy and what they're making in the street economy. Because that opens up an enormous number of doors. Like, are they doing sex work, which many people are? Are they selling drugs? Are they loaning money? Are they, and if you can do these things, and I understand sometimes you don't even want to know, but you do kind of, right? Especially if everybody's living together and stuff, you want to know what's going on in the room, in the building. And so to ask, how else are you making money? Are there other ways that you're, and how else are you spending money? Again, just opens up, suddenly you're like not so much of a chump, Well,
and I think I was in Mark's talk earlier, and he talks about how people aren't asking what ethnicity you are, right? They're guessing. It's the same thing, not the same thing, but very similar to this. Like, we pussyfoot around these questions. And I think there's a lot of power in me sitting with someone and being like, do you do sex work? How much do you bring in? And then also, there's harm reduction techniques for sex work, right? Do you need condoms? We have them all throughout our building, and they're empty every other day. Thank God. I'll get more. I have the budget. New York City gives them to us, Like, take them.
No, you so want to know if your people are doing, right? I mean, what is more risky than sex work? I have a whole set of slides on harm reduction and sex work and risk, right? And we were doing a training on IPV with people who are trans, and dating violence for people who are trans. Remember, what was it? 89%. 89% dating violence if you're trans, right? So sex work when you're trans, we're talking like sky high risk. We're talking murder, right? We're talking risk of murder. So that's the highest risk when you're trans and doing sex work is murder, followed by HIV, followed by overdose, and these other things. So yeah, you really, if you can ask a question that's going to make someone comfortable enough to actually begin that conversation. And if it doesn't, that's fine. Ask it again, right? You planted a seed. Go back. Water that seed. That seed's going to grow.
Boundaries are critical. One thing that we focus on highly at Walton is making sure that our clients have the availability to switch between building operations and clinical services, which means that if they having problems with lease violations, and they still able to receive services from me, the program director, or their life coach. But if they are having problems fulfilling services, or having problems with other tenants, we use the building operations and their lease to hold them in non-compliance with that. So we try to use either side in order to get them to listen to us. And so when it comes around behavior, I allow my tenants to smoke, drink, do whatever they feel comfortable if we're talking, like on camera. But if we're not on camera and no one can account for my actions, I don't do none of that stuff in the apartment with them. So if I'm in an apartment with them or I'm alone by myself.
Clarify, she never does that stuff with them.
I apologize. But so if I'm in their apartment and they're wanting to talk, I either say like, let's go outside if you want to smoke, or let's go downstairs where other people will be able to see us together talking. But for the most part, like, it's kind of free range. I just let them know that I have to still do a job regardless of how they feel about me. I still need to do a job because I can get fired for any little thing. And
I'm a hard ass.
his words, not mine, okay? One thing that has really helped is learning and giving individualistic boundaries to each tenant. So certain tenants have more boundary issues than others. So you have to give them more regulations and more like, remember I said that? Remember we agreed to that? So some people work better with rules and some people don't. So I just try to fluctuate and do it based on who I'm dealing with in the moment.
Well, and I think to add to the separation between clinical and building management, I never want my clinical staff, my case managers, we call them life coaches at Walton, but I never want them to go knock on the door and be like, where's your rent, right? I want them to be able to sit down with the client and be like, okay, you're 2 months in arrears, what can I do to help you figure this out? Operations, property management can be the ones that are giving them the letters, maybe sending them to court, and we can be the ones to assist them. We're keeping the alliance with them so that they can still seek the services for everything else that's going on. So that's like my biggest, I think the biggest strength in having a little bit of separation. Knowing that back behind the scenes, we are all one team, right? We're sitting in the meetings together and we're figuring out this stuff together. But being able to take different tactics with the tenants and keep the allegiance with their social services is like super paramount.
And there are organizations that function with a much stronger also divide between building and services, where building management and lease discussions do not involve services at all, right? Where those things are kept, because, I mean, people are not going to talk to you about their drug use if you have something to do with their rent and their finances, right? And if they perceive you as in control of taking their housing away from them, right? That's smart on their part. Right? They're being very smart when they don't talk to you about their drugs, because they imagine that you're telling people about, their private business. These are their individual apartments. So yeah, what's next?
So relying on the written agreements and policies. So there's definitely a difference between the lease and the occupancy agreements. The lease is our friend, right? We all know this. It's the only thing that we can use to discipline, which is a dumb word, but it's the only thing we can hold them accountable to. So it's our friend. It's a good tool. Again, we've had some fights break out in our building over the past couple of days. Fights between tenants, obviously that's a lease violation. We can send letters to them, but then there comes a point where letters don't mean anything, because in New York City, what takes a long time? The eviction process. Do we want to evict any of our tenants? No. Do we want them to feel some kind of heat under their butts? Yes. So we gotta toe that line, right? So one thing I said to one of our tenants yesterday, actually, she got kind of up in arms with me, like, you have to do something to control this place. Like, it's up to you. It's up to your staff. And I was like, and she's throwing her lease in my face. Like, these are our apartments. We can shut our door if something's going on. What are you going to do? They're going to come after you in the offices. And I was like, I can ride my bike home, to my apartment. You live here. You stay here. This is your house. This is your community. And I'm going to do, and my staff is going to do anything that we can to raise you up, to help you to the next level of education, employment, savings, blah, 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 right? But if you want this community to function in the way that you want, there has to be some kind of consensus among all of you. You have to create alliance with each other. You guys are the ones that are going to be able to hold each other accountable to this. Who am I? Who am I, right? I don't live with you. And I'm not going to be there when you move out to your next place.
And I think it's also, the lease also represents, I think the reason the lease is so important and the reason we say lease is your friend is because the lease is a universal standard, right? So it's a skill that people we all need to strive toward understanding and whatever, because wherever you rent, the leases kind of look the same, and they apply to everyone, and so it's about helping people with hardcore skills as opposed to sort of being authoritarian or anything like that. That's where we are. Oh man, so what was this? Oh, we did that. All right. And I'll just say about the idea of the occupancy agreement, right? So if the lease is a general standard for your contract, right? So you give a certain amount of money to live in a place, but in addition to that, you also have to abide by these rules. Like you have to give the money by this date, blah, 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 right? It's a contract. And we all have all different kinds of contracts that we have to engage in. But the occupancy rules, those are our community rules. That's how we decide, right? Like 10 p.m., we're going to be quiet, whatever, right? And if you create a tenant council, it's a really helpful harm reduction tool because it's an empowerment tool, right? It's a way to, as supportive housing providers, we don't have any authority as staff people. We have all these requirements that we have to fulfill from our contractors and stuff, but everybody has their own leased apartment, right? We just kind of work there during the day. So the most important thing to do is to consistently say and create ways where people can create their own standards, where they have the opportunity to set their own occupancy agreements, to say, this is our community, this is our building, this is what we want. We don't want it at 10. You said 10. We want it at 11. We want it at midnight. So set it at midnight. And that doesn't work. Okay, so it doesn't work. So then people set it back to 10. Okay. I mean, that is so important to say, because then when things go wrong, you can say, okay, so bring it up to the tenant council. Like, what are you looking at? You know what I mean?
Self-efficacy.
Yes, it's really, really important to create a structure that's clear, where the people who live in the residence have a government by which they have actual power to create sort of the rules for their own community, right?
We're 11 months in at Walton House, and we're just in the process of starting this, right? So everyone's finally comfortable in their living situation, if you will. And we've broached the subject with them about doing this tenant council. And over the past month, I've had multiple people come to my office with outlandish requests and very realistic ones. And it's about kind of balancing them into a council that's going to govern themselves well. It's going to take a while, right? I'm probably going to have to sit in meetings myself as the director for maybe 6 months and gradually back off and just touch base with a leader or something. And they'll come and we'll take those things to the staff meeting and we can make the changes that they want to see. We can do the things in the community that they want to do. I'm hopeful that this will help lead to our incident levels being a little bit lower because people will have pride in their community, right? They'll feel like, I've done something here. I want this to run well. Because again, who am I to say I want this to run well? Like, I can't control it. I can only set the framework for it. Overdose prevention. So overdose prevention, obviously. Narcan is something that Jericho is now requiring all of our staff to be trained in. Narcan utilization, right? So everyone in Walton House has been sent to the Narcan training. We've actually had Narcan trainings on site. And everyone has their kits. They're in our desks. Our house managers, our front desk staff have multiples in their cabinets. Fortunately, unfortunately, we have utilized it in the building. We have saved one life. We've used it once. But this is something that is obviously a huge push in supportive housing, a huge push in New York City. I'm sure you've all seen billboards and subway ads. I actually had one of my very close friends who works in the music industry text me if I wanted to go to a Narcan training with him because he saw that like on a subway and he thinks that's something he should travel with because his friends sometimes use cocaine, right? That's amazing. That's a civilian, if you will, who's asking, like, should I go to this Narcan training? Yes, you should. We actually just ordered yesterday not lockboxes, they're open, but essentially like first aid boxes that are meant for Narcan kits that are going on each one of our floors so that our residents or like house managers, if they're running upstairs for something, they can grab it out. And there's a clear window so we can see if they're gone. What if someone steals the Narcan? Good. Take it. We'll replace it. Right? Like, it's not harmful. Like, take it. Yeah.
But so while it's really important that all the staff are trained in Narcan, what's even better?
Tenants, yes.
Yeah, right. So you want to get as many of the Narcan kits among users as possible. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
So I work in the supportive housing unit. I'm Jayleen. I work for community access.
Hi, Jayleen.
I've recently been training my tenants on every floor how to administer Narcan, and they've been labeled as the first responders of our building. It's a suggestion for everybody, and it's a way to keep everybody safe when staff is not in the building. A lot of our organizations are not 24/7. That's
Yeah.
the reality. Our tenants are alone at 8 o'clock in the morning, or maybe with a security person in the front, but basically alone. They only have each other. We should be teaching them how to save each other when we're not there.
Sure. People are much more likely to use with a friend than they are with us. Right?
Very
Make
true.
sense? So they're much more likely to overdose with a friend than they are with us. Pep and prep. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So Pep and Prep, familiar? Yes. No, I hear no's. So two different things. PrEP is a pre-exposure to HIV. It's a preventative, right? You go to the doctor, you get prescribed a daily pill, Truvada is what it's called, and it essentially lowers your risk of getting the HIV virus from sexual encounters by 90%, is the statistic. So it's a huge boon. It's also incredibly expensive if you don't have insurance, which is its own issue that I have a lot of feelings about. But most of our clients would be eligible for the financial assistance or would have really good insurance, right? Then PEP is when you are HIV positive. It's It's when you fear that you were exposed. It is, I believe, a week.
It's like a morning after pill.
Yeah, that you take for a week, and it also lowers the risk of the HIV taking hold within you.
But it's really important that I was having a dinner with my friend Charles, who runs Housing Works, a while back, and he was reporting that at that moment they had achieved zero viral, and Housing Works serves people with HIV in its supportive housing predominantly, and they had achieved undetectable status for every single person in their supportive housing. And now that makes so much sense, right? Because that means everything. If you get your viral load, right? So if you're on antiretrovirals, or what I'm trying to say is this: in supportive housing, and this is something that we've set as a goal at Walton House, right? That everyone who is HIV positive will get to an undetectable viral load, which means that after 6 months, they will not be able to spread it to anyone, right? 2, that nobody seroconverts, right? Because people are on PrEP. So nobody will become HIV positive. So that is completely achievable in supportive housing. Nobody should have an active viral load. Nobody should have active HIV disease in supportive housing because they're in supportive housing, right? Like, so I feel really, really strongly about that we should really hold that for ourselves as a standard.
Well, and something else to point out with PrEP. So as a requirement, your doctor will have you come back every single 3 months, every quarter, to have blood work done. So this isn't, and that's, making sure that you're you're HIV negative and no other STDs, right? But they're also testing your blood for other things. So it's keeping our clients consistent, especially our young clients. I don't know about anyone in this room, but throughout my 20s, maybe I got 3 physicals. It's not something you think about when you're that age, right? So this helps to hold them accountable to that, to their health. I want to make sure we leave enough time for questions.
Yeah, we have one slide left.
Oh, one slide.
But what I want to say is, it's not unrealistic for us to imagine. We're starting to imagine eradicating HIV in New York. We're starting to imagine and have a plan to eradicate it in New York, and we're starting to imagine and have a plan to eradicate it in the U.S. It is not in any way a stretch or impossible for us to think about eradicating it in supportive housing, right? Like, I mean, that's, and we should. I just think that's really important. So, U equals U, right? Undetectable means untransmittable. If you have a 0 viral or under 200 copies for more than 6 months, you are undetectable. That's amazing. You can have kids. You can, I mean, it's just like really, it's undetectable. And
I think, so we went through a lot of our examples.
yeah, we
throughout.
already did this. So
Yeah.
now, thank you so much for listening to all of this, for staying. That's kind of phenomenal. And we want to know if you could ask us some questions, if you have any questions.
And they really want you to come up to the microphone.
Jaylene,
Come on,
on up.
come on.
Step on down, Jaylene. Community access in the house.
You were my boss at one time. So I just wanted to say that harm reduction is not just about drug use. I'm going to say it again. Harm reduction is not just about drug use. It's about eating disorders. It's about mental health diagnoses. It's about hearing voices. It's about everything. It's very broad. So with that being said, if you are walking into your places of work with judgment, you are disservicing your tenants already. Just by walking in with judgment, by coming in thinking that you might be better than somebody because of where they are, you are already giving a disservice. Okay? That's one. 2, when you're talking about drug use, yes, we want to talk about reducing because that's what we're aiming for, reducing the harm. However, reducing the harm also means meeting people where they are. If somebody insists on using IV drugs, teach them how to bevel up. That means inject towards the heart because injecting the other way can be fatal. That means teaching them about wound care, connecting them to syringe exchange programs, harm reduction programs that give substance use kits. And that does not mean we're giving them drugs. It means we're giving them the safe, clean supplies they need so they do not catch bacterial infections, STIs, STDs, and so on and so forth. It's so much bigger than that. If you're not interested in what your tenants, clients, residents, whatever you want to call them, if you're not really interested and invested on what it is they are doing and doing to their bodies, you are not going to get anywhere. You have to do your own research. You have to go sign up for trainings, even the trainings your boss doesn't tell you about. You need to be active. If you're not active, you're not going to make a change. You're just setting yourself up. And people are not going to want to talk to you if they feel like all you want to discuss is going to methadone or going to detox. Please, stop. Go with your tenants to a harm reduction center. They're all over the city. Lower East Side Harm Reduction Center, Boom Health in the Bronx, St. Anne's Corner Project, all of these wonderful places that do so much for our people that we're not doing in our buildings, that we should be learning from. Community Access now gives substance use kits to our tenants. I have them in my office. I give them out every day, all day. I'd rather my tenants have a clean cooker or a clean crack pipe, stem, whatever you want to call it, than to be out in the street picking it up from the floor and thinking that they're safe.
Cool.
You need to do the work. That's what harm reduction is. It comes from you. It's your passion. If you don't have the passion, then maybe go somewhere else.
I hear your passion. Where's your question?
So, no, thank you, totally makes me proud. Are there any other questions about anything we talked about or issues you're having, examples you want to, yeah. You do? You have a question? Are you coming?
I don't think so. No. They're already,
I thought-
speaking of harm
I
reduction,
thought she's like, I thought
they're
you were-
taking the
I thought
escalator
you
to
were
the
like-
drinks downstairs.
I know, no. I thought she was saying, come on over here. And I'm like, no, I have to stay up here for a while longer. But anyway, it's, and also be easy on yourselves, too. I do have to say, it's hard, and it's, we're compassionate beings. We're judgmental people and humans, right? Humans are judgmental, but we're also incredibly compassionate. And that's part of sometimes why our judgment comes up too, right? Is that we see people and we see them suffering. And sometimes the easiest thing we can say and turn to someone to do is say, stop doing that, stop doing that, stop doing that. And the problem is that that's just not effective. That's just not effective. That's why we're moving away from that. Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Thank you for sharing. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about when you're working with staff and you're dealing with someone who maybe doesn't have a lot of experience in talking to clients who have used, and they take on a lot of that responsibility and risk themselves, which can lead to burnout and other things. Like, how do you tend to talk to folks about those boundaries within the work itself?
I think a lot of it has to take place like within supervision, right? So first of all, our employees being honest about those feelings. It is something that isn't inherently natural, right? Like Nina was saying, judgment is kind of the natural response. Our own, how we grew up, how we're perceiving things, that's what we're placing on our clients, and that's what we kind of have to shift our perspective on. So I think it's letting them know that it's not about you. Like we shouldn't be taking on anything that our clients are doing. And that's impossible, right? We care about these people. That's why we make the money we do, But utilizing supervision and making sure self-care is a conversation that you have every single week that you're sitting with your employees, asking them to be honest and being honest with them too about your own burnout. I've alluded a few times to the things that are happening within my own building, and I take it on. I think, like, how do I make my clients stop fighting each other? Like, how do I do that? And the fact is I'm not going to. I'm not their father. I'm not the police. All I can do is
Say stop.
say stop. All I can do is have the conversations with them after and discuss what happened, what the thought processes were, and what the consequences were for them. Not necessarily from me, not necessarily from Walton House, but for their physical self. Their swollen hands, their black eyes, their loss of a job because they couldn't go to work the next day. Like, talking through those situations and how their behaviors affected their immediate life. Because some of these folks don't have the forethought that you and I might have. If I get in a fight in the street and I can't go to work the next day, I have something on my arrest record or whatever, right? Like, I lose my job. Like, these are thoughts that are going through my head, like when someone yells a slur at me or something walking down the street. My client may say, the way I was brought up, I'm going after him. I'm going to be like, I have nothing to prove to them. My pride is not dictated by that person. But certain clients of mine have said to me, like, you spit at me, you might as well have punched me. I have to respond to that. And I want to be like, no, you don't. But they might. They might think that they do, right? They might feel that they do. And I can't change that for them. I can only talk through, and maybe I do share it. Like, we don't share a lot of ourselves with our clients, but sometimes little pieces like that are important to share. Like, my thought process of this would be, what's yours? You know?
I was gonna say it also shows it's better to be empathetic and not sympathetic. That sometimes in us trying to make someone understand their situation, we end up putting more sympathy on it than we actually need to. Like, it's a feeling. It needs to be processed and it needs to be handled. And I think that if we tackle our emotions like that, it makes it easier to deal with other people's emotions.
Yeah, I do think self-care is a really big thing, and I do also want to say that, yes, we are judgmental, all of us, that's for sure. But the truth is we're compassionate first. When somebody goes up on a stage and they fall, the first thing we all do is gasp. And then we say, oh God, I can't believe she didn't see that step. What is wrong with her? Do you know what I mean? So the judgment comes for sure. That is embarrassing. She's never going to live that down. You know, like that stuff comes. But the first thing we do is gasp because we see that someone has fallen. And so that's why we're here. And you can always respond from that place first. Like that place you respond from first. The judgment comes later. And it's actually more innate. That's actually built into our nervous system, mirror neurons. Like, I'm looking at this guy, and he looks kind of sleepy. And I'm thinking to myself, that is making me feel a little sleepy. But I can tell. And then I'm thinking to myself, damn, that means I didn't do so good. But anyway, we'll talk later. But the point is, when you see
I did
somebody's...
awesome, so.
Yeah. When you see somebody's facial expressions, you as an animal actually... You take on, for a split second, you take on that expression. And you take on that feeling. You actually feel it. You register it as a feeling in your body. So that's why you're all here, because you're all really, really compassionate human beings. And that's where we come from. And that's where harm reduction comes from, because harm reduction really does understand that compassion is in all of us, and that's how we connect. That's how we help each other. That seems like a good place to drop the mic. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, and keep up all your amazing work. There it is.